The battlefield stretched far beyond the horizon, a wasteland of smoldering wreckage and blackened skies. Shattered spacecraft littered the ground like discarded toys, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning metal. The Coalition's forces had fought valiantly against the relentless invaders, but victory had come at a heavy price. Among the debris, a lone figure lay motionless. Vurek, the once mighty warrior of the Xorithian race, was pinned beneath the wreckage of his own battle mech. His sleek, scaled armor was cracked, his ceremonial blade shattered. Once the pride of his people, he now found himself broken, paralyzed from the waist down after a final desperate attempt to save the Coalition fleet from destruction. A rescue ship hovered in the distance, evacuating survivors. Coalition medics moved quickly, scanning the battlefield for any remaining life signs. When they reached Vurek, one glance told them everything they needed to know. The lead medic, a tall eviction with shimmering blue feathers, sighed heavily and shook his head. "Too far gone," he muttered. "The resources it would take to save him. It's not worth it." Vurek's sharp yellow eyes burned with anger and shame, but he said nothing. He knew the truth. Among the Xorithians, a warrior who could not fight was no warrior at all. His people valued strength above all else, and he had none left to offer. Nearby, a human soldier overheard the exchange. Corporal Ryan Carter, a lean man with dark hair and sharp green eyes, had been searching for survivors. His rifle was slung across his back, and his uniform was streaked with dirt and blood. He stopped in his tracks when he saw Vurek. "What do you mean, not worth it?" Ryan demanded, stepping forward. The medic frowned. "Human, stay out of this. The Xorithians have their own code. Vurek knows this better than anyone. He'd want us to save others who can still fight." Ryan looked at Vurek, seeing the pain and humiliation etched on his face. He'd heard the stories about this warrior, how Vurek had led countless successful campaigns, how his strategies had saved entire planets. And now, the Coalition was ready to leave him behind like scrap metal. Ryan's jaw tightened. "I don't care about his code or yours. He's not just some casualty. He's a person." "Do not waste your time," Vurek said, his voice low and rasping. "My people do not value those who cannot stand. Leave me. You would only dishonor yourself by helping me." "Dishonor?" Ryan barked a humorless laugh. "I don't care about honor, and I sure don't care about your people's messed up rules. I care about keeping people alive." The medic rolled his eyes and turned away. "Suit yourself, human, but don't expect us to wait for you." Ryan crouched next to Vurek and began assessing the situation. The mech's debris was heavy, too heavy for him to lift alone. "Looks like you're stuck with me," he said with a wry smile. "Why?" Vurek asked, his voice soft but tinged with disbelief. "You have no reason to risk yourself for me." Ryan paused, his green eyes meeting Vurek's. "Because I've been there. I've watched people get left behind. Good people. And I promised myself I'd never let it happen again." With a grunt of effort, Ryan began prying at the debris. He used a piece of twisted metal as leverage, muscles straining as he worked to free the warrior. Vurek remained silent, watching this strange, stubborn human. The minutes stretched on, but Ryan didn't stop. Finally, with a loud groan of protest, the wreckage shifted, freeing Vurek. Ryan dropped to his knees, panting, but he grinned. "There. Step one done. I cannot walk," Vurek reminded him, though there was a flicker of something, gratitude, in his voice. "Yeah, I figured that," Ryan said, pulling a compact medical kit from his pack. "Let's patch you up first, and then I'll figure out how to carry you." Vurek watched as Ryan cleaned and bandaged his wounds with careful precision. The human's hands were steady, his expression focused. It was clear that Ryan had done this many times before. When the rescue ship finally lifted off without them, leaving the battlefield silent, Vurek spoke again. "You are a fool, human." Ryan chuckled. "Maybe, but I'm a fool who doesn't leave his friends behind." "Friends?" Vurek repeated, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Yeah," Ryan said, slinging his rifle back over his shoulder. "We'll get through this, Varek. Together." And with that, the human soldier began dragging the paralyzed alien warrior across the battlefield, determined to prove that no life was ever worthless. Not to him. Ryan had never imagined that the battle for survival would feel like this. It wasn't just about staying alive anymore. It was about keeping his word, keeping Varek alive. The days had blended together. Ryan and Varek had taken refuge in a crumbling structure, a former military outpost long abandoned by both sides. The walls were cracked and broken, the floor littered with old supplies that had been left to rot. The air smelled stale, but it was safer than the open battlefield. Ryan's first priority was food and water. He found a few cans of rations, enough to keep them going for a couple of days. Varek sat in the corner of the room, his eyes scanning their surroundings but doing little else. His paralysis had left him helpless in a world built on action. He couldn't even stand, much less fight. "I don't know how long we can keep hiding," Ryan said as he rummaged through a battered supply crate. "We need to find a way to get back to the Coalition. I'm sure they're looking for us." Varek's yellow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. "They will not look for me," he said, his voice bitter. "Not after what happened. The Exorethians will never return for a disabled warrior." Ryan paused. He didn't fully understand the complexities of Varek's culture, but he knew the warrior was more than just pride. He was angry, yes, but also afraid. Fear of being forgotten, of being thrown away by his own people. "You're wrong," Ryan said firmly, as he turned back to Varek. "They'll come. You're a hero. They can't just leave you behind like this. But until then, we're gonna make it. We'll get through this." Varek said nothing, but there was a slight shift in his posture. For the first time since their crash, he seemed to be considering Ryan's words, albeit reluctantly. The next morning, Ryan set out to scavenge more supplies. He left Varek in their makeshift shelter, promising to return before dark. As he navigated the ruined cityscape, he kept an eye out for any sign of enemy patrols. The Coalition forces had made their retreat days ago, and Ryan knew it would be a matter of time before the enemy closed in on them. He moved quickly and quietly, darting between the shadows of destroyed buildings. It was strange to be in a place where everything was abandoned, where no one cared anymore. But Ryan wasn't going to let this place be their tomb. By midday, he had found a cache of medical supplies, a few energy packs, and a damaged but still functional data terminal. The terminal flickered to life when he plugged it in, displaying a series of messages. It was a long shot, but Ryan quickly began scanning the messages for any sign of Coalition activity. His fingers flew across the device's worn screen, searching for something, anything that could help them. Then, just as he was about to give up, a new message appeared. It was a transmission from an emergency rescue team, marked with a Coalition ID. The message was simple. "Search party leaving for planet Gorthan in 12 hours. Coordinate 37.89, 12.44. Be there." Ryan's heart raced. They had a chance. The rescue team would be close by. They just had to reach them before the enemy did. Back at the outpost, Varek sat silently, staring at nothing in particular. His mind was swirling with thoughts of his people, of his failure, and of the strange human who had refused to abandon him. The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. He had been raised to believe that only the strong mattered, that survival was earned through power and courage. But here was Ryan, a human who had saved his life with nothing but sheer willpower. Varek had been trained to fight, not to be saved. But Ryan had proven that there was another way. When Ryan returned to the shelter, carrying a sack of supplies and a determined look on his face, Varek knew something had changed. "We're going," Ryan said, crouching beside Varek. He laid out the map he had found and showed the coordinates. "There's a rescue team heading to a location nearby. We'll have to move quickly. Can you make it?" Varek stared at the map, then at Ryan. His thoughts churned. The idea of depending on a human, someone so different from him, felt strange. But the truth was undeniable. Ryan had been his only ally in a world that had turned its back on him. And now this human was offering him a chance to survive, a chance to prove that he was more than just a fallen warrior. "I will make it," Vurek said, his voice steady. Ryan smiled, relief flooding through him. He knew that their journey wasn't going to be easy. But with Vurek by his side, he felt more determined than ever. Together, they would face whatever came their way. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Ryan glanced at Vurek. "We've got this," he said with confidence. Vurek nodded, his fierce spirit beginning to rise once more. For the first time in days, he felt a spark of hope. Together, they would defy the odds. The path to the rescue coordinates wasn't an easy one. The city was a ruin, its streets filled with the echoes of past battles. Ryan and Vurek moved cautiously, using the shattered remnants of buildings as cover. They couldn't afford to be seen. The enemy was still searching for survivors, and Ryan knew that the closer they got to the rescue site, the more dangerous it would become. Vurek, though paralyzed, had proven to be an asset. His strategic mind was sharp as ever, and he guided Ryan through the safest routes, pointing out places where enemy patrols were likely to be. The warriors' knowledge of the terrain, combined with Ryan's quick thinking, allowed them to stay one step ahead of the danger. But that didn't mean they were safe. As they reached the outskirts of the city, the sound of distant engines hummed in the air. Ryan's heart sank. Enemy vehicles. They were closing in on their location. "Vurek, we've got to move. Fast," Ryan whispered, grabbing the warrior's exoskeleton and helping him to his feet. "I hear them," Vurek said, his voice low and controlled. "They are too close. We will not make it if we stay here." Ryan scanned the area. The buildings ahead were tall but fragile, the perfect spot for an ambush. They had to get there before the enemy did. "Follow me," Ryan said, pulling Vurek along. "Stick to the shadows." The two of them moved quickly, ducking low as they dashed from one broken structure to the next. Ryan kept a careful eye on the horizon, watching for any signs of movement. The sound of the vehicles was getting louder. As they rounded a corner, Ryan caught sight of two enemy soldiers. They were crouched behind a pile of rubble, speaking to each other. Ryan's pulse quickened. They were only about 20 meters away. Ryan dropped to a crouch, pulling Vurek beside him. "Stay down," he whispered. Vurek's sharp eyes tracked the soldiers. Despite his disability, he was always alert, always aware. He nodded, understanding the need for silence. They waited, holding their breath. The soldiers continued to chat, unaware that they were being watched. Ryan knew this moment could decide everything. One wrong move, and they would be caught. He had to act quickly. Ryan reached into his pack and pulled out a small device, a flash grenade. He set the timer and tossed it behind the soldiers. It clattered against the rubble before rolling into their midst. The explosion of light and sound was blinding. The soldiers yelped, stumbling back, disoriented. Ryan didn't waste a second. He grabbed Vurek's exoskeleton and pulled him into the next building, moving quickly through the chaos. As they slipped into the shadows, Ryan looked back. The soldiers were still stumbling around, trying to regain their bearings. They had no idea what had just happened. "We're not out of danger yet," Ryan muttered. Vurek nodded, his mind still focused despite the confusion. "We will have to hurry," he said, his voice sharper now. "The enemy will recover quickly." They didn't waste any more time. Ryan pulled Vurek through the maze of broken streets, keeping low and moving as fast as possible. The rescue site was close, just a few kilometers away. But the closer they got, the more they could feel the weight of their pursuers closing in. Ryan's thoughts raced as he calculated their chances. They had to make it. The alternative wasn't something he was willing to consider. Then, a new sound reached his ears, the distinct roar of a jet engine. Ryan glanced up, and saw two enemy aircraft soaring overhead. "They're searching for us from the sky now," Ryan said, his voice tense. "Then we must move faster," Varek replied. "I have a plan." Ryan looked at the warrior in surprise. "What do you mean?" Varek turned his head, focusing on the terrain ahead. "We will need to take the high ground. The buildings will provide cover, but we must move carefully. I know a way to outsmart them." Ryan felt a flicker of hope. Varek had led countless successful missions in the past. Maybe, just maybe, his plan would work. They reached a cluster of tall, crumbling buildings. Varek guided Ryan to a narrow alleyway that led upward toward a broken tower. The tower was an old communication relay, but it offered a vantage point high above the city, exactly what they needed. As they made their way up the crumbling staircase, Ryan felt the weight of every second. The jets were circling now, and he knew they wouldn't be able to hide for much longer. They had to get to the top and prepare to signal the rescue team. At the top of the tower, they took cover behind a shattered wall. Ryan looked out at the city, trying to spot the rescue team. He could see nothing yet. "We're almost there," Ryan said, his voice tight with hope. Varek was scanning the horizon, his eyes narrowing. "Not yet," he said, his voice calm. "We need to be patient. The enemy is close." Ryan nodded, gripping his rifle tightly. It was a waiting game now. They had done all they could, and all they could do now was hope that the rescue team would reach them before the enemy did. Below, the sound of the jets grew louder. They were coming closer. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. "We have to move," Ryan said urgently. "We can't stay here." But before they could make another move, a voice crackled through Ryan's comm device. "Corporal Carter, this is Rescue Team Bravo. We've located you. Prepare to extract." Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The rescue team was here. They were going to make it. "We're coming," Ryan replied, a sense of relief flooding through him. "Hold tight." As the jets roared overhead, they heard the sound of helicopters approaching from the distance. Help was finally on its way. The sound of the helicopters grew louder as the rescue team neared, but just as hope began to rise, the ground beneath Ryan's feet seemed to tremble. The enemy jets were still circling, their engines roaring overhead. Varek's sharp eyes scanned the sky. "They are closing in," he said quietly. "We will not have much time." Ryan gripped his rifle tighter, his mind racing. The rescue team was almost here, but they needed to buy more time. He looked at Varek, seeing the warrior's fierce determination despite his situation. Despite everything, Varek was still ready to fight. "We'll hold them off," Ryan said, looking back at the horizon. "We can make it." Varek gave a slight nod, though his face showed the weight of their predicament. The area around them was barren, and there was no real cover. If the jets spotted them, they would have no chance to escape. They had to outsmart them. Ryan's thoughts raced. There were only two of them, one paralyzed, one human. They couldn't win a fight against jet fighters and ground troops. But if they could delay the enemy just long enough. Then an idea struck him. He turned to Varek, his face lighting up with a plan. "Do you have any explosive charges?" Varek raised an eyebrow. "Explosives? I was a warrior, not a demolition expert." Ryan smirked. "Yeah, I get it. But I was hoping you might have something left from your time with the Torethian forces. Anything that could help us distract them." Varek thought for a moment before nodding. "I have a few small devices left. They are not powerful, but they will create enough noise to draw attention." Ryan's heart raced with the possibilities. "Perfect. That's all we need. Let's make them think there's a bigger threat nearby." As Ryan quickly worked with Varek to rig the devices, he couldn't help but feel a surge of respect for the warrior. Despite his physical limitations, Varek's mind was sharp, and his experience was invaluable. This was no longer just a human helping an alien. They were a team, two different beings united by the will to survive. Once the devices were set, Ryan crawled to the edge of the tower and peered down. The enemy jets were still patrolling. Unaware of the trap, they were about to walk into. He knew they didn't have much time. "On my mark," Ryan said, looking at Vurek. The warrior nodded, preparing himself for the chaos to come. Ryan reached for the trigger on the devices, his hand shaking slightly from the adrenaline rushing through him. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. "Now," he shouted. Ryan pressed the trigger, and the small explosive devices went off, sending massive clouds of dust and debris into the air. The loud bangs echoed across the open landscape, followed by thick smoke rising into the sky. The jets, caught off guard, immediately banked to investigate the source of the explosion. Ryan pulled back, retreating deeper into the tower. Vurek followed, his exoskeleton allowing him to move with surprising agility despite his paralysis. The two of them crouched behind the shattered walls, watching as the jets swooped down toward the explosion. The jets circled the area, trying to locate the source of the disturbance. Ryan's heart pounded as the minutes stretched on. The enemy forces had taken the bait, but they couldn't keep this up forever. "We need to move," Ryan whispered urgently. "The rescue team will be here any minute, but we can't let them spot us before then." Vurek nodded once more. "Agreed. They will not expect us to hide for long. We must get to the extraction point." Ryan scanned the sky again. The jets were still there, flying in tight circles, their pilots trying to make sense of the situation. As long as the rescue team kept their distance, they would be safe for now. But just as hope began to settle in, a new threat appeared. Ryan's eyes widened as a convoy of enemy ground vehicles appeared on the horizon. They were moving quickly, heading straight for the area where the explosion had occurred. The enemy was mobilizing for a full-scale search. "We don't have much time," Ryan muttered. "We need to make a run for it. Now." Vurek's gaze hardened. "We will not make it if we move too quickly. We must take the high ground again and use the last of our devices to create another distraction." Ryan nodded, understanding the warriors' plan. They couldn't outrun the enemy vehicles, but they could use the terrain to their advantage. The two of them scrambled up to the higher levels of the tower once more. From their vantage point, they could see the enemy vehicles closing in on the area. Ryan quickly activated the last of Vurek's explosives, setting them along a key route the enemy would take. "This should slow them down," Ryan said, checking the timer on the devices. "I trust you," Vurek replied, his voice calm but determined. As the vehicles neared, Ryan gave the signal, and the final explosions erupted, sending up a wall of smoke and debris. The vehicles screeched to a halt, the drivers unable to proceed. For a moment, it seemed like they had done it. The enemy was delayed. The rescue team was close. But just as Ryan allowed himself a small sigh of relief, a sharp voice came through his comm device. "This is Captain Serrano of Rescue Team Bravo. We've encountered enemy resistance. We're under fire. Hold tight." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. The rescue team was being held back. They couldn't let the enemy stop them now. "They're coming for us," Ryan said grimly. "We need to hold on just a little longer." Vurek met his gaze, his eyes burning with determination. "We will. We are not done yet." Together, they waited. And for the first time in days, Ryan felt like they had a chance. The situation was growing more desperate by the minute. Ryan's heart raced as the sound of enemy vehicles and jets filled the air. The explosions they had set off were only a temporary distraction. The enemy would be regrouping and coming for them soon. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. Ryan glanced at Vurek, who was focused, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the rescue team. The warrior's exoskeleton was battered, but it still held strong. Despite his injuries and paralysis, Vurek exuded a sense of calm and determination that steadied Ryan's nerves. They had been through so much together, and now it was a matter of surviving just a little longer. "We need to get to the extraction point," Ryan said urgently. "The rescue team is still fighting, but they're close. We can't let the enemy take us now." Vurek nodded without hesitation. "Agreed. But we must move quickly and stay hidden. The enemy will be looking for us. We will not be able to fight them all." Ryan didn't need to be reminded. He knew that facing the full force of the enemy was a fight they could not win. But the rescue team was close, and all they had to do was hold on. The two of them moved swiftly, avoiding the open areas and sticking to the narrow alleyways between the ruined buildings. The sounds of the enemy were getting louder as they pushed forward, but Ryan and Virik managed to stay just out of sight. They reached the outskirts of the city, where a large open field lay between them and the extraction point. The field was a dangerous place, wide open and easy for enemies to spot. It was their final obstacle. "We need to cross this field," Ryan said. "It's our only way out." Virik looked out across the field, considering their options. "We will have to use the terrain. Stay low. If we can make it to the trees on the far side, we might have a chance." Ryan nodded. "Let's go." They set out, moving as quietly as possible, crouched low to avoid being seen. The field seemed endless, and every step felt like it could be their last. Ryan could hear the distant hum of the enemy's engines growing closer. His grip on his rifle tightened, ready for whatever might come. As they neared the center of the field, a shout rang out from behind them. "Stop right there." Ryan froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He didn't dare turn around. There was no way to fight their way out of this. Virik's eyes narrowed. He had heard the voice too. Slowly, without making a sound, he gestured for Ryan to crouch lower, moving closer to the ground. The enemy soldiers had spotted them. Ryan could hear the faint rustling of their footsteps as they advanced. They were closing in fast, and the two of them would have no time to escape. "Move forward," Virik whispered urgently, his voice low. "We will have to make a run for it." Ryan didn't hesitate. He sprinted across the open field, pushing his body to the limit. He could hear Virik's exoskeleton whirring behind him, the warrior keeping pace despite the heavy burden of his injuries. The sound of enemy footsteps grew louder. Ryan could hear the enemy soldiers shouting, ordering each other to surround them. There was no escape if they stayed in the open. Just as Ryan thought they were about to be caught, he heard a new sound, one he had been waiting for. The roar of helicopter blades. "We're almost there," Ryan shouted. Virik's face showed the slightest hint of hope. "Do not stop," he urged, pushing forward with renewed strength. Ahead, through the trees, Ryan saw the flicker of movement. The rescue team had arrived. But the enemy was closing in faster than he had hoped. The helicopters were hovering just above them, their guns trained on the approaching soldiers. Ryan reached the edge of the field, breathing heavily, just as the first enemy soldier stepped into the clearing. The soldier raised his rifle to fire, but before he could pull the trigger, the rescue team opened fire. The loud crack of gunfire filled the air as the enemy soldiers scattered, taking cover. Ryan didn't wait. He reached the landing zone and grabbed hold of the helicopter's lowered rope ladder. Virik followed close behind, his exoskeleton making it harder for him to move quickly, but the warrior was determined. As they climbed into the helicopter, Ryan turned to look at the battlefield. The enemy was still regrouping, but they were too late. The rescue team had arrived just in time. Virik collapsed into a seat next to Ryan, breathing heavily, exhausted but alive. Ryan could see the warrior's expression, no longer full of bitterness, but something else. Gratitude. "We made it," Ryan said, glancing over at Virik. The warrior gave a small, approving nod. "We did. Thanks to you." Ryan smiled, his heart still pounding. He had never thought he would be in this position, helping an alien warrior escape certain death. But now, more than ever, he realized that survival wasn't just about strength or power. It was about choosing to fight when everything seemed hopeless. As the helicopter lifted into the air, leaving the war-torn planet behind, Ryan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. He had kept his promise. He had saved Virik, and together, they had defied the odds. The battle wasn't over, but this victory, this one moment of survival, was enough to remind Ryan of the power of hope. The helicopter soared high above the ruined city, the distant hum of enemy jets fading into the background. Ryan gazed out the window, watching the wreckage below slowly disappear as they flew further from the planet's surface. The tension that had gripped him for days started to release, but his mind was still racing. They had made it. They had survived, but only just. Next to him, Vurek sat in silence, his expression unreadable. The warrior's once proud armor was scratched and worn, a reminder of the brutal battles they had endured together. Though he had been paralyzed, Vurek had been an invaluable ally, his mind sharp, his courage unbroken. Yet Ryan knew the toll the war had taken on him. Vurek had lost more than just his physical strength. He had lost his people, his planet, his entire life. Ryan turned to look at Vurek. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. The warrior's piercing eyes met Ryan's, and for a moment, the two shared an unspoken understanding. "I will be," Vurek said finally, his voice steady. "It will take time, but I will survive. We both will." Ryan nodded. There was a strength in Vurek that Ryan admired. Even after everything they had been through, Vurek had not given up. And that resilience, that ability to keep moving forward, was something Ryan had come to depend on. The helicopter continued its journey through the skies, heading toward the safety of the fleet. As they approached, Ryan could see the outlines of massive ships in the distance, waiting to take them away from the war-torn planet. "We're almost there," Ryan said, his voice filled with relief. "We made it." Vurek did not reply, but Ryan could see the slight change in his posture. It wasn't joy. No, Vurek's journey was far from over, but it was something else. Perhaps for the first time in a long while. A sense of hope. Ryan looked back at the city one last time, the smoke from the fires still rising in thick plumes. So much had been lost. Lives, homes, entire civilizations had been torn apart in the name of conflict. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the war was far from over. "We've seen too much," Ryan said softly, almost to himself. Vurek's gaze followed his, and there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "I have seen too much as well," the warrior said quietly. "The cost of survival is high, but we endure. We must." Ryan's thoughts drifted to the moments of destruction they had witnessed. The cities burning, the people running for their lives, the soldiers who had fought not just for survival, but for their beliefs, their homes, their families. "Do you ever wonder," Ryan asked, turning to Vurek again, "if it's all worth it, fighting like this?" Vurek was silent for a long time, as though weighing his words carefully. "I wonder," he said finally, "if we fight because we must, or because we have forgotten how to stop. The war is not the true enemy. It is what it has made of us. But in the end, we survive, and that is what matters." Ryan absorbed his words, his gaze turning back to the horizon. Vurek was right. There was no going back to the way things had been. But if survival was all that remained, then Ryan would fight to protect what little peace he could find. A voice suddenly crackled over the comm system. "Corporal Carter, this is command. We've received your status report. You and Vurek are cleared for extraction. Prepare for debriefing upon arrival." Ryan sighed with relief. They had made it. The mission was over. But a new chapter was just beginning. "We're almost there," he said, more to himself than to Vurek. "We made it." Vurek gave a nod, though his expression remained unreadable. The warrior knew that survival wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a new struggle. The universe was vast, and war was only one part of the chaos that lived in its corners. But for now, they were safe. For now, they had won. The helicopter began its descent, the massive ships below growing larger. Ryan looked around, taking in the faces of the other soldiers who had been part of the mission. They were tired, worn down, but alive. They had done their job. They had made it out. Vurek turned his head slowly toward Ryan. "I owe you my life, human. You and your people, you are not like the others. Ryan smiled faintly. We're just trying to survive, same as you. I didn't do it alone. Varek seemed to consider this. Perhaps, he said, his voice quiet. But you acted when others would not. That is not something I will forget. Ryan's smile faded, and for a moment, there was only silence between them. Both men, both warriors from different worlds, had seen things they would never be able to forget, but they had made it out together. As the helicopter touched down on the deck of one of the massive ships, Ryan felt the weight of the mission finally lift off his shoulders. He stepped out of the helicopter, the steady ground beneath his feet a welcome relief. Varek followed him, though it was clear the warrior's journey was far from over. But for now, they were safe. And that, Ryan thought, was enough. The vast ship loomed before them as Ryan stepped off the helicopter, the sound of its blades slowly fading into the distance. The massive structure felt like a safe haven, a reminder that they had made it through the worst. But even as the pressure lifted from his shoulders, Ryan knew that their journey was far from over. He glanced over at Varek, who moved stiffly but with quiet determination. The warrior's injuries were still visible, and though he had survived the brutal attack, there was no denying that the war had taken a toll. Ryan could see the weight of it in his eyes. You did well, Ryan said, his voice steady. You fought hard. You survived. Varek gave a small nod, his gaze distant. Survival is the only thing that matters now. Ryan nodded in agreement. The world they knew had been forever changed, and the path forward would be full of challenges. But for now, they were alive, and that was a victory in itself. They were led into the heart of the ship by a small group of soldiers, each of them weary but glad to have the mission behind them. The hum of the engines beneath their feet was a steady reminder that they were no longer on the battlefield. They were safe, at least for the moment. Inside, the walls were lined with bright lights, and the sound of voices echoed in the halls. Ryan could see technicians and medical staff moving quickly, preparing to treat the injured and assess the situation. The war had cost them dearly, but now they had a chance to regroup. Ryan, Carter, and Varek, one of the officers, called as they approached. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with short-cropped hair and a serious expression. I'm Captain Williams. Welcome aboard. Ryan saluted the captain, and Varek followed suit, though it was clear that the warrior was still adjusting to the new environment. We'll get you both to the medical bay, Captain Williams continued. You're both in need of rest and treatment. After that, you'll have a debriefing with command. Ryan nodded. He had known the debriefing was coming. It was standard procedure after a mission, but his mind wasn't on that. It was on the future, the uncertainty of what was to come next. The medical bay was quiet, the soft hum of machinery and the beeping of monitors filling the space. Ryan sat on a nearby bed while Varek was placed on a table, his injuries carefully assessed. The medical staff worked quickly and efficiently, checking their vitals and administering the care they needed. As Ryan rested, his thoughts drifted to the time he had spent with Varek. The alien warrior had been his unlikely ally, and together they had fought through unimaginable odds. But now that the mission was over, Ryan couldn't help but wonder if they would ever be truly free of the war. What happens next? Ryan asked softly, turning to Varek. The warrior met his gaze, his eyes still clouded with the weight of the past. I do not know. The war is not over. There are still many battles to be fought, but we will fight them on our terms, not on theirs. Ryan felt a flicker of hope. On our terms, he repeated. He liked the sound of that. The idea that they could have some control over their future, that they didn't have to be pawns in someone else's game, was comforting. For the first time since the mission began, Ryan allowed himself to relax. The fear and exhaustion that had haunted him for so long began to fade. There was still much to do, but at least they had made it this far. They had survived. A few hours later, after receiving treatment and a few hours of much-needed sleep, Ryan and Varek were escorted to the briefing room. Command had already prepared a full report on the mission, but Ryan could tell that the higher-ups had more questions than answers. Captain Williams sat at the head of the table, his face grim. "We've received some troubling news," he began. "While your mission was a success, the war is far from over. There are factions still at war with each other, and we have no idea who will come out on top." Ryan nodded, bracing himself for what was to come. "What does that mean for us?" he asked. "It means," Captain Williams said, "that we must prepare for the possibility of even greater conflict. We're in uncharted territory now, and we need all hands on deck to ensure our survival." Ryan exchanged a glance with Varric. The warrior's eyes were sharp, alert. It was clear he was already planning his next move. "So what's our next step?" Ryan asked. "We rebuild," Captain Williams said, his tone firm. "We don't just fight the war, we take the fight to them. We rebuild alliances, strengthen our forces, and prepare for whatever comes next." Ryan felt a sense of determination rising within him. They had survived the worst, but the war was far from over. The battle for the future had just begun. Varric, despite the pain he still carried, spoke up. "Then we rebuild. But we do it differently. No more fighting for the wrong reasons. We fight for those who have no voice, for those who cannot defend themselves." Ryan felt a spark of hope at Varric's words. The warrior had found something worth fighting for, something greater than just survival. They had made it through the darkest moments together, and now they would face whatever came next as allies. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long while, Ryan felt ready. Together, they would rebuild, and they would fight, not just for survival, but for a better future. The war had taken much from them, but it had not broken them. And as long as they stood together, there was hope.